Yeah. Is there a... Okay, we won't pound the duck tonight, but hello, everybody. Thanks for being here. Welcome to RF, especially if you're here for the first time, at least in this room. It's great to see you all here. A couple of announcements that I'm going to try and remember. This Saturday is our debate night, and we have decided to rewatch the debate between William Lane Craig and the Right Reverend John Shelby Spong, Bishop of the Episcopal Diocese of Newark, and also a godless heathen who doesn't believe in the resurrection. And so this is it was an interesting debate, and there were only a few of us who got to see it last time because it was in the spring semester when people were really busy. So now it's going to be an interesting talk, and so this Saturday at 7, same time, same place, we'll be watching that debate. Everybody is welcome, and there will probably be pizza as well. So we'll eat, watch that debate, discuss it, and listen to God being some sort of miracle worker is the preview. Yeah. Okay. In the next Saturday after that is the Unapologetic Conference in Saginaw, which I might ask Eric to talk about because it's his conference. But we have free access to it, so I'm just going to say again that you can... I'll make sure to announce the information this evening because I forgot to write it today, that that conference is in Fort Worth, and we'll probably all go together depending on the size of the ride and stuff. And Eric can provide further details about that conference next week if he wants to. Then also we're going to have Janksgiving just so that everybody can mark it on their calendars. The Friday before the break is the night that we hang out and have a janky Thanksgiving, which is just a cheap Thanksgiving where we can all bring stuff. And there'll be information forthcoming about that. But if you want to have your calendar marked for, I think it's November 20th. 22nd of November in one of the clubhouses, probably at UTD. That is always a really fun time for us to just hang out and mess around. All right. Whenever Eric is close to being ready, Eric Hernandez is the main apologetics guy for the Baptist General Convention of Texas. Very smart, engaging guy. It's always great when he is with us. Last time he talked with us about the lazy approach to evangelism, which you just saw there. I guess this evening we're going to be talking about strongholds in our culture, dominant philosophies, and why they fail, and why Christianity is triumphant over them. So, and then if you'd also like to talk a little bit about the Unapologetic Conference, that'd be great too. So Take it away, Eric.
Sounds good. I don't know why I pulled the chair. Thank you. Yeah, great to be with you guys as always. For the sake of time, I want to jump in. Most of y'all know me. Raise your hand if you've heard me speak before, or this is your first time hearing me speak. I'm trying to see who's paying attention, who's listening. So for the second time, I do want to jump in. So let's start at a time where this will. Why aren't you changing? There we go. All right. So if you want, you can turn with me to 2 Corinthians chapter 4. 2 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 4 and 5. And what we're going to see here, we're going to talk about the dominant stronghold. So that's the biblical word for it. The more academic or philosophical apologetic word would be worldviews. And this is also from my book. And this is a big part of my book because I think part of the reason I call this a lazy approach is not because it's inherently lazy, but when you understand a worldview, you understand the strongholds in the culture, you can easily and more quickly identify problems and be able to stick to the issues that are relevant. So, for example, if I were just yesterday, or no, actually just a few hours ago, I did a live Q&A on a friend of mine's YouTube channel on the soul. This guy we start talking, and I give a case for the soul, and then he says something to the effect of like, well, what scientific evidence is there for the soul? You haven't provided any scientific evidence, even though my opening was literally, this is not a scientific question. And what my point was, which we'll go through shortly, was, well, if the soul exists, it's non-physical, and science is limited to the physical, so why would you ask to use a scientific discipline that's limited to the physical to try and investigate something non-physical? Right? It's a category fallacy. So note how I'm not like trying to give a scientific argument. I'm not trying to. What I'm doing is just addressing the stronghold behind the question. 2 Corinthians chapter 10, 4 and 5, you find something interesting where Paul gives us some insight into the discipline and task of spiritual warfare. And he says, the weapons we fight with are not carnal, they're not physical. He says, but the purpose of them is for the pulling down of strongholds. Now, you might think, well, what is a stronghold? And growing up, I was told his strongholds were like, addictions, demon possession, alcoholism. It could encompass that, but he actually defines it in verse 5. And he says, "In as much as we refute, tear down, destroy arguments, reasonings, and every high and proud thing that sets itself up against the knowledge of God." Which means, biblically speaking, according to this passage, Paul defines a stronghold as things like thoughts, ideas, reasonings, philosophies, arguments, presuppositions, any false belief or set of beliefs that will hinder someone from coming to a salvific knowledge of God. And according to Scripture, this is quite literally the spiritual warfare within our culture. So understand this, is that when a person has a stronghold in their life, according to this passage, we see that they cannot come to a knowledge or salvific knowledge or perhaps even a deeper knowledge of God with such strongholds. So, one thing I won't have time, well, actually, we are going to get into a little bit, but I spend more time on this in the book, is that strongholds are not unique to non-believers. Even believers can have false ideas within their theological beliefs. That's a whole separate issue. We will touch on that a little bit. But with this in mind, let's talk about this. We're going to go through the 3 dominant strongholds, but I want to start with a warm-up stronghold known as skepticism. Now, skepticism at its core is essentially a kind of epistemology. Anybody know what that means? Yeah. Very good. Study of knowledge and beliefs. While this is not a dominant stronghold in the culture, it is certainly a dominant stronghold amongst non-believers. And in the book, I go through the mindset and method, how to identify this, because you cannot refute and tear down a stronghold, right? That's the goal within spiritual warfare, is to destroy the stronghold. And it should go without saying, our aim is to destroy the idea, not the person. But you cannot destroy or demolish something that you cannot even identify. So with skepticism, typically a lot of skeptics will hold to both of these 2 requirements of skepticism. One would be that knowledge requires certainty. So in other words, according to the skeptic's view of knowledge, if I claim to know something, I have to have absolute 100% certainty about the thing I'm claiming to know. However, by the same token, if the mere possibility of doubt arises to what I claim to know, according to the skeptic, I cannot claim to know it. So this is known as Cartesian certainty. And I guarantee you've come across this notion without even realizing it. So for example, what was René Descartes' famous saying? Why did he say that? Yes, and what was he responding to? Like why, in other words, he wasn't just sitting down just kind of thinking of these things. Why go there? We're getting there. Yes, essentially. How do you know anything? You know why? He's responding to skepticism. So around his time, skepticism was on the rise, and the idea was if you cannot be certain, you cannot claim to know it. So he began to think and say, well, what is something I can be 100% certain about? And quite frankly, there is not too much we can be 100% certain about. And that's okay. We'll touch on that in a second. So what he began to do was begin to assess, and I'm going to paraphrase his line of thought, essentially. And he thought this way, well, I know one thing for certain, that it cannot possibly be the case that I'm wrong about this, namely that I exist. Why? Because once I begin to doubt my existence, I am beginning to think. So that means in order to doubt that I exist, I must first think. However, if I'm thinking, that means I exist. Hence, I think, therefore, I am. Yeah, it's the interactive portion of the presentation. Yeah, I think, therefore, I am. So you might think, okay, awesome, cool story, who cares? Well, here's another part of the skeptic worldview when it comes to our epistemology. A lot of them may also say this, well, the problem is that nothing can be known for certain. In fact, I debated a skeptic named Matt Dillahunty on the Soul. You can find it on my channel. And in part of that debate, he asked, or rather he said, we can't be absolutely certain about anything. Now, why is this relevant? And especially when it comes to evangelism. Suppose you're presenting a case for Christianity to someone. And mind you, skeptics don't wear name tags necessarily that say, hello, my name is skeptic, right? So it's going to have to be something you pay attention to in the way they word or phrase what they're saying. So this happened to me once. I was talking with a young man, and as we were going through the resurrection, one of the points of the resurrection is that Paul claims that 500 people saw him at once. And he stopped me and said, but wait a minute, Why would you trust the senses of these uneducated, ignorant, illiterate, superstitious peasants who didn't know anything about how the world works? Why would you trust their senses? I said, what do you mean? He says, well, haven't your senses ever deceived you? Sure. I mean, there's times where I've driven down the road on long road trips, and about a mile down the road, I see this puddle of water around the highway, but as I approach it, it disappears. Why? Mirage, right? There was no water there. So I'll being honest with them, I said, yeah, sure, my senses have deceived me. Or you look at a straw, in water and it looks bent, right? Yes, my senses have deceived me. And he says, okay, is it possible that your senses could be deceiving you now? So note already the sentiment of skepticism here. He said, is it possible your senses could be deceiving you now? I said, sure, it's possible. And even right now, it's possible my senses could be deceiving me. Now, I don't think I'm being deceived because, I've had vivid dreams that I thought were real only to wake up and realize I was just dreaming. Now, I don't think that's the case now because I'm wearing pants. So I think we're good. But sure, my senses, it's possible they're deceiving me now. And he said, okay, well, think of it this way. If you cannot trust your senses in 21st century, our American society, with all our technology and scientific advancements, if you still can't 100% trust your senses today, then why would you trust the senses of these ancient, illiterate, uneducated, superstitious people? Why would you trust what they claim to see? And thus, if this is your case for Christianity, well, I now have reason to doubt it, and you can't claim to know it, and so why should I believe it? Stronghold. Now, before I go into a response, what are your thoughts? How would you respond to that? Go ahead.
There's a lot of things that we can't know certainly, like with absolute certainty, but that we still accept.
But the skeptic would say, okay, you could maybe be pragmatic about it, but you can't claim to know it.
Well, I would say it's more than pragmatism. It's just reasonable in a lot of cases to accept.
But it's also reasonable to doubt it, is what he would say, perhaps. Or you have reason to doubt it. Or if you can doubt it, or if you can't be 100% certain, you shouldn't claim to know it. Let me come over here. Go ahead.
Do you have reason to trust your own faculties that are causing you to doubt?
He might say no. And neither should you. So why should he believe you? Go ahead. Yeah. Back there. No, someone raised their hand.
Oh.
Did you?
Yeah.
Or was that you? Go ahead.
I was thinking something along the lines of what he was saying,
Okay.
how do you know that for certain or something like that?
Okay. We're getting there. Y'all are still doing way too much work, though. Think lazy approach. I'll go to one more person. You had your hand up last.
This isn't the answer you're looking for, but I would say, like when it comes to something like the resurrection, I would say, yes, it's possible that we can be deceiving ourselves. They could have deceived their senses. But if it's possible either way and our evidence is inconclusive, which I don't think it is, we can go to a more consequentialist framework where objective morality or the contributions Christianity has made to society make it a better thing to believe that the resurrection actually happened, and so you can at least put some stock in it because of that.
And he might like that. He might say, okay, so let's not claim it's true. Let's not claim we can know it. But at best, you can say it's pragmatic. Mm-hmm. And he might say, well, I don't have a problem with that. You do you. I'm not going to judge you for your beliefs. Kumbaya. Pat you on the head. Right? All right. Here's how I responded. So here's my quick response. Think lazy approach. You want to get to the heart of the issue here. So what I first did was I clarified. This is a good idea. Is you want to clarify what the other person's saying to make sure you haven't misunderstood them. But this can also set up your pieces for your response. On the front cover of my book, it's a chess piece. You'll see a king on the floor with the pawn standing up. This is to represent big victory, little piece, right? So here's what I said. I asked a question. My question was this. How do you know that? Now, if you didn't catch that, let this sink in. I said, let me see if I understand you correctly. You're telling me that knowledge requires absolute certainty. He said, yep. And you're telling me that really nothing can be known for certain. He goes, right. And I'm like, but wait a minute. If that's the case, wouldn't that mean that we can't know anything? And he said, yes, you're getting it now. I'm like, oh, okay, cool. I said, but wait a minute then. If Knowledge requires certainty. Nothing can be known for certain. And if that would mean that we can't know anything, well, then how do you know that your skeptical position is correct? And he looked at me just really stunned. Note, I'm not arguing with him. I'm not even disagreeing that my sense. All I'm doing is getting to the heart of what the stronghold is here. And I said, and on top of that, something about your analogy you gave about the water on the freeway, that troubles me a little bit. He said, what do you mean? I said, well, you're telling me that the reason I cannot trust my senses is because I have evidence that my senses have deceived me in the past. He said, right. I said, okay, yeah. But here's the problem. The only reason I knew my senses were deceiving me was because when I drove closer, my sense of sight informed me there was no water there. So are you essentially telling me that in order to know that I can't trust my senses, I must first trust my senses in order to know that I can't trust them to begin with? Or am I missing something here? Back to Matt Dillahunty. He said, I don't think we can be absolutely certain about anything. I said, are you absolutely certain? He said, no. I'm like, so why should I believe you? So note, again, lots to say here, but what I want to show you is first, it's important to know what it is. Once you know what it is, then you can learn how to identify it. And when you understand it and know how to identify it, you can get to the heart of the issue a lot faster without kind of chasing rabbit trails and doing really, in my opinion, unnecessary legwork. So with this in mind, let's go through the dominant strongholds of our culture. What I want to do is start by defining what it is. We're going to go through each three. And then from here, I want us to learn how to identify, and it goes without saying, we're just going to scratch the surface because, I have a whole chapters on each one of them on identifying, then a whole chapter just on responding. And I want us to learn how to identify them in 3 C's. Identify them in the church, in the culture, and in conversation. And note right here, church. I submit to you and I'll show you that each one of these have crept into the church in some form or fashion, and we haven't even realized how it's affected us. So not only have we not responded or, according to Paul's words, destroyed the stronghold, we don't even recognize or realize it's here in many instances. Okay, and then we'll show how to recognize it in culture and then how to respond to this, recognize in conversation. After that, then we'll go to responses to them. All right, so let's start with the first one. And you may be pretty familiar with this. It's known as postmodernism or relativism. And again, to start with the definition, part of grasping this, and I'm being that many of you are apologists, you may be familiar with this already, but you have the difference between objective truth and subjective truth. So an objective truth would be something that is true independent of my thought or opinion of it. And by contrast, a subjective truth would be dependent on or relative to human thought or opinion. So if I said Christianity is true, is that an objectively true claim, or is that a claim that's meant to be objectively true or subjectively true? Meant to be objectively true. If I said Taco Bell to me is the best food around, manna sent from heaven, what kind of truth am I giving? What's that?
It's just not.
It's objective truth. No. It's subjective, right? It's dependent on me. Whereas Christianity would not be dependent on me, whether that's true or false. Now, within postmodernism, there is an emphasis, if not a total rejection, of objective truth and an emphasis on subjective truth. And for many relativists, it's not just that, it kind of depends, right? Because with skepticism, a person can be a skeptic and a relativist, or a skeptic and the others that we're going to touch on. But let's say you have a relativist or postmodernist / skeptic. Not only will they think that there is only subjective truth, they may even say, look, I do believe there is objective truth, I just don't think we can know it, because there's always room for doubt. And thus, the only thing we can get at best is subjective truth. Yes?
Is postmodernism more of an epistemology or an ontology?
Good question. In the book, I talk about how to identify these worldviews epistemically and ontologically. Okay. And within postmodernism, because that's why I put relativism in parentheses. And for that, to answer that question this way, the postmodernists will believe epistemically, truth is going to revolve around me, what I feel, what I prefer. And for many, same thing with reality. Hence, you find this like law of attraction or this like manifest, right? Let's manifest this. You ever heard that phrase? You can right. Literally, you can create something from reality by really wishing it or wanting it. So yeah, it even bleeds into the ontology there. Very good. So let's look now at conversation. How do we look at this here? So you may hear these phrases pop up. for postmodernism, again, / relativism, it'd be that truth is relative. There is no right or wrong. There is no absolute truth. So to kind of give an idea of their way of thinking. So here's a chair, and suppose there were a dog here. I could say there's a dog to the right of the chair, but someone in the front row, Alan, could say, no, there's a dog to the left of the chair. Now, who would be right and who would be wrong?
Both right.
We're both right. Why? Because it depends on your perspective. And in the same way, says the postmodernist, doesn't really matter what God you worship, doesn't matter what church you attend, doesn't even really matter what you believe, because truth is relative and dependent on your perspective or your preference, yada, yada, yada. So you might hear things like, if you're against same-sex marriage, that's fine, that's your right as an American, but don't tell someone else they can't marry who they love, because that would be your truth, not theirs. And you're against abortion? Okay, if you're a man, don't talk about it, and that's fine, don't have one, but don't tell this young lady that she can't do what's best for her life, because it's her body, her choice, and so while that may be true for you, it's not true for her, and don't you dare impose your religious morality onto someone else. That's intolerant. So again, it's the sentiment of this relativistic postmodern mindset. Let's look at culture. I saw this, there was this picture tweeted. This was actually tweeted by an airline, and it was for Pride Month, and it said, doesn't matter who you click it with, happy Pride. To go a little bit deeper into this, whenever postmodernism infiltrates a culture, what you can do is when you look out in the culture, you typically see two shifts happen with postmodernism. The first is that morality is reduced to politics, and the second is that tolerance is redefined. Now, to touch on the first one, I want you to note this. Within postmodernism, here's a fun fact, something to kind of keep in your back pocket. Suppose you're talking to someone, you're sharing the gospel, or you're talking about Christianity, and they may say something like, look, I'm not saying you're wrong. I'm not even saying I necessarily disagree with you. I'm just saying that doesn't work for me. Now, why would a postmodernist never tell you that you are wrong for your beliefs?
Because they don't believe in a wrong.
Why don't they believe that there's a wrong?
Because they think it's all about perspective, right? It could be right for you.
Right. There cannot be an objective wrong unless there is first an objective right, and on postmodernism, there is none. So when someone's being, you may perceive it as, oh, look how respectful they're being towards me. We had such a great conversation, they didn't even say I was wrong. And it's like, well, bless your heart. It's not because they didn't disagree with you. It's because in their mind there is no objective right. But note how even someone just missing that simple point. Oh, man, we had great gospel conversations on UT Dallas. Oh, really? How'd they go? Well, no one disagreed with us. No one said we were wrong, and they encouraged us to keep doing, what we feel is right. I don't know if I'd say that's progress, but what you're missing is, wow, you missed a chance to address a stronghold in their life that is a genuine obstacle to even considering Christianity. And note that within this type of mentality, Scripture won't be seen as an objective, valid mandates of truth for guiding our lives. It's just really a cultural relative list of suggestions for people who were trying their best at that time that they were living. Right? Not God's inerrant inspired word. So, given that there is no right or wrong, I can't ever say that you're right or wrong. At best, I can say that you're politically correct or incorrect. Now, I could spend a lot more time on this, but I want you to think of it this way and note the problems with this. Morality is reduced to politics. Why? Well, one reason, there is no objective right, so there can be no objective wrong. But note that if that's the sentiment, then it's pointless to try and change the moral landscape, because all I have to do is change the political landscape and I've done my job. But here's the problem with that. And again, we could spend lots of time on this. I don't necessarily want to, but take generosity, for example. The Bible speaks about generosity, and I hear lots of people saying, well, you're a Christian, you should be in favor of fill in the blank for this political view or position. If I forced everyone here to give me $20 and went to give it to charity, does that make you generous? No. Is it a generous thing to do to give money? Yes, but is generosity merely giving money? When I pay my taxes, I'm not being generous. I guarantee you, I wish I didn't have to. It's a whole other issue. But here's my point. Scripture focuses on the heart and intent of a person, not just the action. So I cannot force you to be generous. but generosity becomes a moral value. But if there is no objective right or wrong, no objective morality, then the best shot I got is to go for the politics. And I want to make this clear too. Let me first say, I'm not saying we shouldn't be involved in politics. I wish more Christians were educated enough and understood enough to be involved in politics. But on the one extreme, we shouldn't say no politics, just Jesus. On the other extreme, you don't want to think that by changing the political landscape, you have somehow changed the moral landscape. When you look at the New Testament, you look at the early church, do you know how Rome was transformed? It wasn't by winning elections, it was by getting people saved. And their hearts were changed. That's what changed the culture, not the elections or the laws that were being passed. Because quite frankly, I can say abortion is illegal or prostitution or adultery is not right, it's immoral, and make it illegal, but that does not change anyone's heart. It may change their behavior, but God is not just looking for behavior. Jesus said this on the Sermon on the Mount. You haven't slept with anyone, you haven't committed adultery, congratulations, but have you thought about it? So he's not just asking you to be the kind of person that refrains from committing adultery, he's asking you to be the kind of person that doesn't even want to commit adultery. That's a whole different story. And I cannot change that by just legislating laws. Again, I think we should vote according to Scripture and our conscience for legislating the right laws, but I want you to understand that it's not what changes hearts. Nevertheless, if there is no objective right or wrong, and I forget the quote, it's from Moreland, that politics becomes a surrogate god for many secularists. That's where the power's at. So, you look at tolerance. What about tolerance? Well, there's a difference between, first, the classical definition of tolerance and the modern definition of tolerance. Classically, tolerance meant I disagree with you, but I still respect you, I still love you, and I will even fight for your right to voice your views publicly. By contrast, the modern definition of tolerance is the view that disagreement itself is intolerant. Now, note the irony here. This right here is no longer accepted. It is now the modern view of tolerance that is now being promoted. But the irony here is that the very notion by definition of tolerance implies I disagree with you. I disagree with your views or your behavior, whatever. And here's why it's ironic. If I agree with what you're saying, I'm not tolerating you, I'm just literally agreeing with you. So the only way I could possibly tolerate your view is if and only if I disagreed with your view to begin with. And yet, ironically, because of the sentiment, disagreement itself is intolerant. So you disagree with same-sex marriage, you must be homophobic. No, I'm not scared of gay people. No, but you're a bigot, you're hateful. Why? Because you disagree with this. Well, you're disagreeing with me. Do you hate me? No, of course not. You'll get that on the way home. All right, so let's look now at the church. Now you might think, okay, given everything we discussed, how in the world would this show up in the church? And I want to just share a few reasons because there's a lot I can go into. First, consider our gospel pitches today. This is one of the main reasons I wanted to write this book and really touch on this, is because if you look at our gospel pitches today, what I typically find is, here's how the gospel is typically presented. Look at my life, look at how God made me happy, look how he fulfilled me, gave me peace and happiness. If you become a Christian, you can get this too. One, that's not the gospel. Literally not the gospel. Two, I am now making the person the center and focus of God, of the gospel, as opposed to God. Right? God is no longer the center of this. So at best, if this person is going to convert, they are not going to convert on the basis that I exist to serve God. They will convert on the basis and the mentality that God exists to serve me. And additionally, I cannot guarantee that someone will have a happy life by becoming a Christian. I cannot guarantee your grandmother won't die of cancer. I cannot guarantee your parents won't get divorced. I cannot guarantee that you'll be happy, fulfilled, and satisfied. Look at the early church. Look at Paul. Look at what he went through. I cannot guarantee that. Nevertheless, when we pitch the gospel in this way, the idea again becomes, well, Christianity is dependent on my experiences. The truth of Christianity is based on my experiences, my testimony, my fill in the blank. And then we've shot ourselves in the foot by doing this. I mean, part of the reason I have a job is because the church did such a horrible job in the past 50 plus years. Let me explain what I mean. If you look at these celebrity Christian deconversion stories, right? Former megachurch pastor, no longer a Christian. Famous Christian author, renounces his faith. Famous worship leader, yada, yada. And almost without fail, on cue, here's what they say. I'm no longer a Christian, and I'm so much happier now. And my immediate thought is, at the risk of sounding cold-hearted, why should I care how happy you are? Because I want to know if it's true. But then it dawns on me, because I'm thinking, why would they say that? As if that mattered. Then it dawns on me, I know why they say that, because that's how the gospel was pitched to them. And so if I convert to Christianity on the basis of happiness, but then begin to study the doctrines of Christianity and realize that, wait a minute, this impedes on my happiness, well, it only makes sense to convert or find a different religion or worldview if that's why I chose it in the first place. Again, lots more I can say there, but it really irks me when you hear pastors saying things like, we don't need apologetics, we just need you to share your story. Here's a fun fact. Christianity would still be true even if you didn't exist. Why? Whatever your answer is, let's maybe start with that one. Now let's look at how it's impacted actually even our evangelism. Here was a Barna study that came out just a few years ago. Almost half of practicing Christian millennials say evangelism is wrong. So they did this study, and these are the generations that they went to. And I want to share some statistics here. 94% said the best thing that could ever happen to someone is for them to come to know Jesus. These are millennials talking. 2, they said 73%, higher than any other generation, said they were gifted at sharing their faith with other people. That's pretty impressive. 47%, however, said it is wrong to share one's personal beliefs with someone of a different faith in hopes that they will one day share the same faith. And then lastly, 40% says if someone disagrees with you, it means they're judging you. Are you picking up what I'm laying down here? I want you to note something. First, note the language being used. Note this. Note how they even define sharing or evangelizing. It's sharing one's personal beliefs. Lots to say here, but my thought was, okay, wait a minute. Something seems off. How can half believe it's wrong to evangelize, but then 70, almost 3/4 of them say that they're gifted and equipped at doing this? And here's the conclusion I came to. Long story short, it seems that for these millennials studied in the survey, evangelizing meant I know how to talk about myself for hours and share my testimony. And if that's what they meant by sharing their faith, then sure, I don't know of any millennial that is not gifted and equipped to talk about themselves for hours. Yeah, no problem. But why would they think it's wrong to do that? Well, again, note the sentiment, this relativistic sentiment, and then note this too. Well, because if Christianity is true because of my experiences and story, then maybe it is wrong to share my testimony because maybe the person I'm talking to has had a different set of life experiences and a story of their own, and thus Christianity is true for me because of my experiences, but if you haven't had those experiences, I cannot expect you to accept this. But again, the mentality being Christianity's truth is dependent on stories and experiences. And then here's one, and I'll skip going deeply into it. Andrew Fletcher said, "Let me write the songs of a nation, and I care not who makes its laws." Even if you look at our worship, postmodern has a big influence there. How so? Again, I'm going to go through this really fast. If you look at a culture's music and look at what they sing about, or the movies, the media, it will typically give you an idea of the stronghold, and you see that for a relativistic postmodern culture, truth and reality revolves around me, my experiences, etc. Now, here's a fun thought experiment. When you get a chance, I want you to think of the average worship song sung at your church Sunday morning. And I want you to draw a line down the middle of the piece of paper, and on one side, write the word I/me. On the other side, write you/God. And I want you to tally up how many times the word I or me is used, and how many times the word you or God is used. And then draw a line under that, and then write how many times a verse uses both of those together, like I and God, or me or you and God, in a verse. And after you've tallied it all up, ask yourself, is this song about me or God? quite frankly, a lot of the praise and worship I hear today is not praise and worship. You're singing about yourself. You're singing about your feelings. And it's definitely not corporate worship. What I have found is that songs that overuse I and me, and don't get me wrong, there's nothing wrong with bringing yourself into the experience. The problem becomes is when the whole experience is based on yourself. Because if that happens, then I don't worship God because he is good. I begin to worship God because I feel good. And if all I'm doing is singing about what God has done in my life, quote unquote, or the benefits I receive from being a Christian, then I'm not worshiping God because of who he is. I'm worshiping God because of who I think I am. And sometimes you're just name dropping. Like, that's not even worship. Like, if it was Alan's birthday and I said, Alan, happy birthday. I'm so glad I'm your friend because you work at the store and I get discounts every time I go. And I'm so glad that it's your birthday because if you didn't exist, I wouldn't be able to go over to your house and eat your, pizza. And you're like, wait a minute, is this a song about him or you? And quite literally, I mean, there's some praise and worship songs I can't even sing to. Because again, it's not even worship. And I'll throw one last thing in. If you look in the book of Revelation, where you see actual singing worship done in heaven, it's from the angels. I challenge anyone to find one time the angels mention themselves.
That's right.
Again, I'm not saying there's anything inherently wrong, but I'm saying if you look at our modern praise and worship, it's certainly not centered around God. Not a lot of it. Scientism. We briefly touched on this. It's also an epistemology. The only way to gain knowledge is through science. The only way to gain knowledge is through science. Now, let's look at conversation. You might hear someone say, if it cannot be proven scientifically, then it either cannot be known or cannot be true. So you want me to believe in God or an afterlife? Show me the quote-unquote scientific evidence for this. Show me a scientist that has gone to heaven with lab equipment, return with empirical, verifiable, demonstrable, repeatable data. Because if you cannot show it scientifically, I have no reason to believe it. When you look at culture, here's one of the clearest memes I've seen to explain this. And I don't think it needs further explanation, but we will go into it. Here's how I identify this in culture. The meme said this: scientists have discovered that people will believe anything if you claim scientists have discovered it. I mean, yeah, pretty much. Now, going deeper into this, here's what J.P. Moreland says. Scientism accords the right to define reality and speak with knowledge and authority to scientists and scientists alone. And when this happens, you have this notion of science versus faith. I know Alan's dealt a lot with this. So you have on the one hand science, right? And then on the other hand, you have your preacher, your pastor. But here's a problem. If you want knowledge, if you want facts, if you want to know the truth, go to this guy. But if you want your heart tickled, you want your feelings warmed up, you want to feel good inside, well, then you can go to this guy for personal beliefs and feelings. And even when you look into the media, what you'll see is, let's say they're doing an interview about the afterlife or something. They'll interview like 10 different religious leaders from different religions. And then, and if you listen to how they phrase the questions, because after that, then they'll interview like 3 scientists, because you only need 3, right? 3 in their own field. And when they interview these religious leaders, it's like, what do you feel deeply in your heart about this? What is your personal conviction? What do you feel is true? And they're like, well, thank you so much for sharing your opinion. That's so sweet. And they go to the scientists, and they're like, Dr. So-and-so, what can you tell us empirically based on your scientific discoveries? What knowledge do we have about this field? Look at the church. Now, with the church, this is more of a reactionary kind of thing. And there's usually 2 extremes whenever I find the church encounters scientism. The first is known as fideism. What is that? Essentially the idea that faith is incompatible with science and reason. And what you see happen from this is you have this pseudo-separation of the sacred from the secular. So to touch on the first one, when a Christian, good intending Christian, they're stuck in a corner, they're talking with a skeptic, they don't know how to answer the questions, they say, look, at the end of the day, it's all about faith. And the skeptic's like, fine with me, I don't have faith, I have science. And it's like, what does that even mean? Right? Like how are these 2 mutually exclusive? And then you have this separation of the sacred from the secular. So, if you want to be in ministry, well, you become an evangelist, you become a preacher, you become a pastor. But if you want to go into the scientific field, well, that's fine. You can go into a secular vocation if you'd like. Well, I thought this was all God's. I thought ministry was to happen any and everywhere. I am no more in quote-unquote ministry than you are just because I'm an apologist and evangelist. You are called to ministry as well. Now, to what extent is a different question, but wherever you are called, whatever vocation you choose, you are called to share the truth, to make disciples. Whether you're working with computers, working with sales, or working with fill in the blank, you are called to make a difference. You are called to share and evangelize and talk to people and share the good news. There is no sacred secular separation. And the second is now we try to naturalize the spiritual. So in the first extreme, everything becomes spiritual. We try to spiritualize the natural. In the second extreme, we try to naturalize the spiritual. I'll give you an example. A friend of mine once said, he said, hey, there's this guy that's going to speak at our church. He reminds me a lot of you. You should come hear him speak. And this was back when I was single and had time to waste. And when someone says, you know, this guy reminds me of you, I kind of want to go hear what this guy talks about because I want to know what they think of me. And I get what he was trying to say, but this guy was a scientist, and he was going to give a presentation. And he started by saying this. He said, we can now, and he was a geneticist, like a legit geneticist. And he said, we can now trust the miracles in the Gospels because we now have the scientific evidence to confirm them. And I thought, okay, let's hear it. And here's what happens, is spiritual matters require quote-unquote scientific explanations. And here's what he said. One example he used was Peter walking on water. And again, he's a geneticist. And he said, we've now discovered that there is something known as epigenetics. And essentially what that is that there are some latent potentialities within your genes, and under certain conditions can activate new potentialities or powers that were already latent there. Okay? And he said, so when Jesus called Peter to walk out on the water, he activated some epigenetic thing in his legs, in his genes, that caused him to float over the water. And I was like, or, call me crazy, or it was a miracle. Now, here's my problem here. I have no problem speculating natural possibilities that could bring about what we consider miraculous events. But here was my main problem. One, his motivation behind this scientific explanation was scientism. He was trying to respond to scientism because, see, if everything has to be done scientifically, then my goodness, now we're tripping over ourselves trying to find the latest scientific answer for how Moses was able to part the Red Sea. And then the second problem was he wasn't responding to the stronghold of scientism. He was literally just falling prey to it. Yeah.
Did that man think that Jesus miraculously changed the epigenetics?
So that's what I don't know. He said something like the tone of his voice and the words that he used, like, it was really weird, really strange. Mm-hmm. But again, no, he's not demolishing the stronghold, he's just falling prey to it, right, being a victim of it. Okay, last one is naturalism. Physical world is all that exists, nothing more, nothing less. When you look in conversation, here are a few things to identify. So within naturalism, there are three key isms. We're just going to go over one or two within naturalism. And of course, there are a variety of naturalists, but we're going to focus on what's called the philosophical naturalist. And you have here what's known as reductionism. What does that mean? It's essentially the notion that everything that exists will be explained and reduced to something physical. So if you can identify reductionism, 9 times out of 10, you're going to identify naturalism. So how do you identify reductionism? Look for the nothing more than or nothing but language. So here's an example. If I said that marriage was nothing more than signing a piece of paper for the government, then I have reduced the essence of marriage to nothing but a legal document. In the same way, for the naturalist, everything, prayer, miracles, consciousness, is going to be reduced to nothing more than or nothing but physics and chemistry. With this in mind, let's look at how this plays out in culture. Literally, as I was writing this chapter, I thought, I know I've heard stuff about something like what I was thinking of. So I literally just Googled what happens in your brain when you pray. First link of the first page of the search, it was Medical News Today, and here's what it said. What religion does to your brain? I'm like, gosh, I can't make this stuff up. It was like, it's right there. And here are a few excerpts. Whether or not a divine power truly exists might be a matter of opinion, but the neurophysiological effects of religious beliefs are scientific facts that can be accurately measured. Note the sentiment. Religion, that's your feelings, that's your convictions, that's in your heart. Science, well, that's in your head. Those are the facts. This is the logic. Scientific facts. And then here's another excerpt. Out-of-body experiences are in your body. Okay? Pieces of the puzzle are coming together to form a scientific picture of divinity that is shaping up to be quite different from those we find in the holy books. So yes, you have your books, you have what you've always believed, you have your traditions, but now we have science. And while you may have opinions, we've got scientific facts. Because again, if it can't be tested scientifically, you can't know it. You can believe it, you can pound the podium really hard and preach it, but you can't claim to know it. So all this was leading up to this in the article, the God helmet. Anybody know what this is? Have you heard of the God helmet? Anybody heard of it? So this is an AI picture. It's not literally the God helmet, but it would look a lot cooler if it looked that way, yeah.
I'm guessing it's that helmet that stimulates the parts of the brain that are
Yes.
triggering the side.
Yes. So basically what happens is, here's what they did. They developed this God helmet, and they put it on I think it was like 20 nuns or something like that. And they asked them to pray, and they said, let us know when you feel God in the room. And they did, and they looked at the parts of the brains that light up, and they're like, oh, okay, interesting. And they eventually mapped those parts of the brain so well enough that they took the same helmet and they put it on an atheist, and actually Richard Dawkins actually wore it one time, and they put it on his brain and they stimulated certain parts of his brain, and he's like, it feels like there's someone here, but I know it's just you, right? That's you. You're pulling my leg. You're like, yeah, it's me. So therefore what? Well, there is no God in the room when you pray to it. How do we know? Because it's nothing more than or nothing but neurons firing in your brain. It's therapeutic, it's nice, but it's more of a placebo effect. There is no God there. Yeah.
Even from a scientific perspective, like if we play their game, I don't think that makes sense.
Yeah. Of course it doesn't.
If I have a thermometer that says it's 90 degrees in the room, it's an electronic thermometer, and then I later discover that by applying a voltage to the test leads, I can have it artificially generate a reading of 90 degrees in the room. Does that mean that I have disproven that it was ever 90 degrees?
Fair enough. I like my example better. Not that I'm biased here. Here's what I say. Suppose we develop a beach helmet, and Alan's never been to the beach, but I have. So they put a beach helmet on my brain, and they say, think about what the sand feels like between your toes. I'm like, okay. And they're like, okay, now think about the waves crashing. Think about the sand. And I start thinking about the stuff, and they map my brain, and Alan's never been. So he has some rare condition that if he goes to the beach, he like dies on the spot or something, right? But he's always wanted to. It's been his, like, it's a Make-A-Wish Foundation. So we take the beach helmet and we put it on Alan's head, and he's like, oh my gosh, I feel like there's something funny and some weird stuff between my toes. And oh my God, what does that sound? Oh, that's those waves. And he gets this experience of the beach. Therefore what? Beaches don't exist. Yeah, you see the absurdity, right? Right, ridiculous, yeah. Well, we're getting ahead of ourselves, but I love it. Okay, so most of you might be familiar with my story. To try and be brief here. So freshman year of college, had a philosophy professor. He was an atheist. He pulls out this pill, says religion wants us to believe in the soul, and this is what gives us hope in an afterlife. This is where our mind, our thoughts, our emotions are. These are all immaterial. But the problem is, if I took this antidepressant pill, which is physical, has the power to change and affect the alleged immaterial states of my soul. But how can that be? How can something tiny and physical affect the immaterial? Because every time scientists look at brain scans, all they find are neurons firing, nothing but neurons firing. And every time we look at the body under a microscope to examine it, all we find are nothing more than the base elements of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, but no scientist has ever discovered something like a soul. Why not? The answer is simple. There is no soul, there is no heaven, there is no hell, there is no God, there is no afterlife. You're just a physical brain and body, and we need to live with this fact, get on with our lives, and stop believing in these foolish fairy tales. Class dismissed. Stronghold. How would you respond to something like that? Because as a freshman in college, I never met anyone that didn't believe in the soul. And for the sake of time, I'll put it this way. For the first time in my life, I heard an argument that if what he's saying is true, Christianity would be false. Why? 1 Corinthians 15, to paraphrase Paul, if there is no resurrection, Christianity is false. And he goes further to say, not only would it be false, but people should actually feel sorry for us for how dumb and gullible we were to believe this stuff to begin with. Well, I submit to you, if there's no soul, there can be no resurrection of me. And if there's no resurrection, once again, Christianity can't be true. So how do you respond? Well, we're out of time, so if you want the answer, you can get my book, The Lazy Approach to Evangelism, for only $20 here. No.
20 minutes.
Yeah, I know.
Oh, okay, I'm sorry. I didn't know if you thought about
Joking.
it was 8. My bad.
No. But yeah, I do have some books for $20, and we have cards. I know last time I came, some people got some. $20, and as I always like to say, as Frank said, I actually stole the joke from him. All proceeds of whatever book you buy goes to feed a hungry family, right? My hungry family. I have a wife and 2 kids, and so I will take all the help I can get. This is my first ministry. So let's go to some responses with the time we have left. So there is no truth. I'm sure you know. What question would you ask to this?
Is that true?
Very good. Is that true? Right? I had a young lady say, Eric, you cannot claim Christianity is true because there is no truth. I said, what you just said, is that true? Because if you're telling me there is no truth, and yet you say it as if it's true, then what you just said can't be true. It's what we call in philosophy self-defeating. I was once invited to a secular left-leaning radio station when I lived in Houston. And basically, what they did was every quarter or so, as a way to demonstrate their tolerance and openness to other ideas, they would intentionally invite someone to their studio who disagreed with what the studio believed. So they got a hold of me through a pastor one day, and they said, hey, would you like to come talk about why you're a Christian? I said, I'd love to. So I get there. I've got about 10 pages of notes. I'm going to use about 5 arguments for God's existence. And right before we're about to walk into the live studio, the atheist technician stops me, and he says, oh, by the way, not only do we allow guests who disagree with us to, voice their opinions, we also invite them so that our audience can interact with their ideas. So are you okay with taking calls? And I'm thinking, that's going to limit my time even more than I thought. And I said, sure, why not? And he said, okay, great. Last time we had a pastor on the show, we only got like 2 or 3 calls. And lots of people, he said, like hundreds, if not thousands of people listen in, but they only call if they find what you say challenging or uncomfortable, or they want to, disagree with you. And I said, yeah, that's fine. First commercial break. 10 minutes into the show, first commercial break. I'm barely on my second point. And as the commercials are rolling, because we're live, he looks at me kind of funny, and he looks at my notes, and he's like, I know there's a lot more you want to say, but all the phone lines are ringing. So do you want to start taking calls? I'm like, nah, I haven't even I barely scratched the surface, right? I barely broken in, but sure, why not? One of the first people call, hey, how you doing? You're on the air. And he says, excuse me, who are you to tell people they're wrong? And I said, what? He said, who are you to tell people they're wrong? Because see, you started talking about you believe in God. That's fine, whatever. People believe in something, I don't care. But then you started talking about Christianity specifically. And are you honestly trying to tell me and everyone else listening that if they're not Christians, they're wrong? I said, yeah. But, I'm not just saying that. I'm giving an argument. He goes, well, you can't do that. You cannot tell people they're wrong. So again, he's like one of the first callers. Lots of other people waiting. So I want to get to the heart of the issue. So first, I'm going to reword what he's saying to clarify, and this is also going to set up my final response. So I said, let me see if I understand you correctly. I said, are you telling me that it is somehow inappropriate or immoral, perhaps, to tell someone they're wrong? Is that what you're telling me? He said, yes. You cannot tell people they're wrong. I said, okay, great. I said, then I guess I just have one more question for you. Then can you please explain to me why you're calling me on a live public radio to tell me that I'm wrong, if it's wrong to tell people that they're wrong? Let's go to the next caller, right? I don't know what else to say here. I had one lady once say, she said, Christians are so intolerant. You're bigots, you're closed-minded, all you do is spew hate speech, yada, yada, yada. I said, okay, ma'am, calm down. Let me see if I understand you correctly. Are you telling me that we should have this idea that we should tolerate everybody's beliefs? Is that what you're saying? Everyone's beliefs should be tolerated. She said, yes, you should tolerate people's beliefs. I said, okay, fantastic. Then I just have one question for you. Then can you please explain why you're not tolerating my beliefs, if we should tolerate everybody's beliefs? Yeah. I will. Hey, look, you need to tolerate my spelling, okay? I will fire my secretary. Thank you. Very good. Now, I want you to look back at this. And I want you to, before we kind of dissect it, ask yourself this question. What is the purpose of seatbelts? Keep us safe.
Flying out of the seat.
To be able to buckle, right? To keep you from potentially dying, right? It could save your life. In fact, this is so important, and our culture recognizes this, so much so that they've actually made laws about this. Here's another tweet. The law enforcement is going to be doing seatbelt checks. Well, why would they do that? Well, because if you don't buckle up, you're breaking the law. Click it or ticket. And note, because it can save lives, right? It's a law you can live with, as they say. Seatbelt saves lives. In other words, we have understood the function and design of a seatbelt so much that if you don't abide by its function and design, you actually get punished for it. Okay? So let's look back at this. So I fly a lot, in my line of work. In fact, just this Friday, I'll be going to El Paso out for a few days. And before we even leave the runway, they always do seatbelt checks. Why? Because that's also part of the law, for airlines. Now imagine if I had this thing going on when they came to look at my seatbelt. Can this potentially save my life? No. No, I couldn't even connect it. What about this one? No. In fact, here's a crazy thing. Before they will even back up out of the where they're parked, I'm not saying fly. Before they even back up, they do 2 seatbelt checks, right? But again, suppose I had this thing going on when they came to me. They're going to say, "Sir, buckle up." Could I look at the stewardess and say, "Excuse me, are you seatbeltophobic? Don't you know it doesn't matter who you click it with?" You can say, "No, sir, seriously, you have to either buckle up or get off the plane." Why? Because this potentially cannot save my life. It was not designed to be used this way. What about this one? Huh, interesting. You know what that means? That means it does matter who you click it with. And note this, if our culture can understand the function, design, and purpose of a seatbelt, so much so that they are willing to punish you for not abiding by its function and design, call me crazy, but I wonder if there is a function, purpose, and design to our bodies, so much so that the designer of it has a right to tell us how to use them and make laws for them. You can't make this stuff up, right? They're literally proving a biblical perspective with this tweet, ironically. It's just a matter of knowing how to point it out. All right, scientism. Science is the only way to gain knowledge about reality. This is false for many reasons. Let's just go through a few. Even today in that live Q&A I did, one of the guys in the live chat that we brought on, he said, "Why should anyone care about non-scientific questions?" And now that I think about it, yeah, I mean, that's not a scientific question, so why should I care about your question? When it comes, there are lots of things we can know that are beyond the realm of science, and I'll give you one, ethics. So here's a thought experiment. In philosophy, you want to find the most reprehensible thought experiments, and the more reprehensible it is, the better you can make your point. So I actually have to be careful when I'm talking philosophy with someone over the phone. Like one time I was outside in my front yard watching my kids play, and I was talking to someone about morality, and I'm like, well, consider this. Suppose you had this 10-month-old baby that they were just torturing for years in a basement. I'm like, hold on, I gotta go inside. That sounds really bad, right? So suppose you have this lady, it's her 100th birthday, she's a grandmother, and when she passes away, her grandson will get $2 million of inheritance money. But the problem is she was still pretty healthy. So to kind of help speed up the process, he's gonna bake her next cake. So he bakes her next cake. Unfortunately, the woman dies, passes away, he gets his money. Now, here's a question. Is what he did wrong? However, if we're going to abide by scientism, the only way to know this is going to have to be scientifically. So let's give it a shot. Let's bring in the world's leading nutritionist in the world. I mean, Nobel Prize winner, right? And they sit down with us and they explain to us how, the nutritional value of the cake, what the poison had, how it affected the cake, how it, affected the calories in the cake. And after a complete scientific analysis of this, we still don't know if it's right or wrong. Okay, let's try something else. Well, now let's bring in the world's leading chemist, right? A toxologist who studies poisons. And then they come in and they analyze a crime scene, and they're able to identify the chemical compound of the poison. They're able to identify how the poison would have mixed into the ingredients of the cake as it baked, and then how it entered, the lady's body. And they give us a full chemical analysis, but guess what? You still can't tell me if it's right or wrong. Okay, so now let's bring in a hematologist, the world's leading hematologist, a blood analysis specialist, And they can tell us how the poison affected the heart, eventually led to, I don't know, clogging her arteries, how it affected the bloodstream, and eventually killed her. But still, no assessment of whether or not this was right or wrong. They can tell us how it happened. They can tell us why it happened. They can tell us a process and mechanistic things that led to the death, but they cannot look under a microscope and say, oh, by the way, it turns out that was wrong. Like it says so right here in the Petri dish. Check it out. Now, note what I'm saying, I'm not saying. I am not saying they didn't know it was wrong. What I am saying is they all knew it was wrong, and none of them had to look under a microscope to say that. Why? Because this is not a scientific question. Ethics is a field of philosophy, and once you begin talking morality, you leave the field of science and enter in the field of philosophy and ethics. So I like to put it this way. Science can only tell you what is the case, but it cannot tell you what ought to be the case. Science can tell you, yep, she is dead, but they can't say, oh, and she ought to not be dead. You cannot get that from, again, studying the chemistry and physics here. On top of that, understand this. I can only believe what science tells me. Well, the problem here is that, first of all, that's not something science can tell you. And second, that's not even a scientific claim. It's a philosophical claim about science. So here's the irony. If you can only believe what science tells you, and given that it's not a scientific belief, it's a philosophical belief, then ironically, you actually shouldn't believe that you can only believe what science tells you, because you're now believing something that's a philosophical statement that doesn't come from science. Hence, it's what you call self-defeating. I can only believe what science tells me. Did science tell you that? No, then don't believe it. Okay. Give me scientific evidence for God. I already talked about this with the soul, but briefly, the problem is that science, while a wonderful tool for studying the physical world, it is a tool that is limited to only the physical world, whereas God, if he exists, is a non-physical entity, and thus you cannot use something that is limited to the physical to try and investigate the non-physical. It would be like going to the beach with your friend. He takes a metal detector with him, splits up, you come back 2 hours later, and he says, hey, I just made a remarkable discovery. Oh yeah, what'd you discover? And he says, I just discovered there was no plastic on this beach. Like, what are you talking about? It's littered with plastic. He goes, no. Not only do I think there's no plastic here, I don't even think plastic exists. And you're like, why would you say that? And he says, I'll tell you why. Because I just spent 2 hours combing this beach, and I found a lot of metal, but never once did I ever detect an ounce of plastic. Now, why did he not detect any plastic? Because he didn't have a plastic detector, he had a metal detector. So in the same way, this is what we call in philosophy a category fallacy. This is like asking, how many pounds does the number 2 weigh, what color is it, and how many can you fit in your back pocket? These are not the right categories to ask for numbers. So in the same way, when an atheist demands scientific evidence for God, as if to imply, let me put them in a test tube under a microscope, they're using the wrong tool for the assessment. No different than saying, Eric, how much do you weigh? And I say, well, hand me that ruler, let's find out. Now, to be clear, you can use scientific evidence that is going to be part of a larger case that is a philosophical argument for God's existence. But my point is, empirically, I cannot point to this and say, look, if you study this and look inside, it's going to say, therefore, God exists. Right? It's not that kind of scientism where if it's not scientific, if it's not empirical or demonstrable, then therefore God doesn't exist. I would even say anything from whether it's fine-tuning of the kalam, these are scientific evidences for premises, scientific premises within a philosophical argument. Make sense? Yeah. Alan, any thoughts on that?
Yes, well said.
Very nice. As long as I get your approval. We're good. All right, naturalism. Let's go through this quickly. And then if there's time for questions, I think we will. And if not, we'll go get some Taco Bell. So, to briefly touch on this, and I've talked on the soul with this group before, but I know there's been some new people here. So I hold to what's known as substance dualism. Let's talk about the soul real quick. And before I go here, if you've heard me ask this line of questions, don't answer. Let everybody else take a swing at this. Before we go here, if you remember, I actually didn't do the church one with this one. I didn't show how this infiltrates the church. So I want to do this in real time here. If you haven't heard me ask these questions, if you have, don't answer these questions. Let everybody else squirm. Audience participation. Can you please point to what part of your body thinks? What part of your body thinks? Okay. Brain. Brain? Does your brain think? Kind of. Do you need a brain to think? Okay. All right, let's switch gears real fast. God the Father, does he have a brain? Yeah, some people didn't answer.
He has my brain.
Some people didn't answer. I hope he didn't. This is not a Mormon group, right?
I think personally that'd be a horrible nightmare.
Reasonable faith isn't a Mormon group, right? It's a Christian evangelical group. No, God does not have a brain. Mormons believe God has a brain because they believe he's physical, but as Christians we believe that God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship him in spirit and truth. Very good. So no, God does not have a brain. But does God think? Oh yeah, absolutely. Well, are you made in his image? No. Huh. So, what part of your body thinks?
I wonder
Now-
if that's a category error.
It is.
Uh,
So let me come clean. It's okay. It's a trick question. No part of your body thinks. And throughout the history of Christianity, there has always been this doctrine that you are an immaterial soul with an immaterial mind made in the image of an immaterial God. However, we live in a culture that is saturated with naturalism, reductionism, and not only has the church not been able to respond to it, we don't even know how to identify or recognize it. So much so that we hook, line, and sinker engage in their language, and on the one hand, we talk about brains that think, but then we come Sunday morning to church, lift our hands, and worship a God that has no brain and thinks just fine, but we never let these two beliefs come together because, quite frankly, we haven't learned how to take our theology that seriously. Stronghold. And you don't even realize it. I could spend all day on that, but point being is, even in the way we think, and this is, again, that pseudo-separation of the sacred and the secular. It's like you have your Christian beliefs here, and then your secular beliefs here, and the twain may never meet. But my goodness, if we could learn how to think holistically, that'd be fantastic. On my view, I hold to substance dualism. It's the view that I am a soul. I'm literally the same thing as my soul. So I have a body, but note on this view, I don't have a soul. Rather, I am a soul, and a body without a soul is nothing more than a corpse. You following me here? Yes? Okay. Now, I actually have to be honest here, because I've recently changed my view on this, to be honest with you. I do think we have souls, that I have a soul, because a few years ago I went to the dealership and I got a Kia Soul, and it's it's orange, parked out there in the parking lot. And I paid real money just to make that joke, and that's why I bought the car. So if I can get a better laugh, I'd appreciate that. It's a very rich punchline, if you will. Yeah. No, but when I was looking for the car, I was actually I'm soul searching for it. Yeah. I gotta milk it. Okay. Literally the only reason I bought this car. So let's look at this. Naturalism. What my professor said, is that true? In fact, let's make it harder. Brain damage, Alzheimer's, it can cause effects in the mind. If you affect the brain, it can affect the mind. Well, is this true? Does it mean that the mind and brain are the same thing? And I'm going to have to be quick here. If the mind and brain are the same thing, as if what my professor said was true, then whatever's true of the mind is going to be true of the brain and vice versa. And to know this, we're going to use Leibniz's law of identity. It basically says that I'm going to skip this. It basically says if two things in question are the same, then whatever's true of one is true of the other. But if I can find something true of one, not true of the other, can't be the same thing. So, are they the same thing? No, because cause or dependence is not the same thing as identity. What does that mean? Remember, in philosophy, identity means literally the same thing as, right? So, is my mind and brain, are they identical? Are they the same thing? No. Why? Because cause or dependence does not establish identity. Suppose I'm a guitar player, but I pop a string. Because of my string pop, I can't play the music. So, in other words, I've shown that I am dependent on a guitar for playing the music. Well, does it follow from this that therefore I am a guitar? No. Suppose I pop another string and I'm no longer able to play the note C, so I can't even play a note. Well, does it follow that therefore if I broke open the guitar and gave it a good shake, the note C would fall out of the guitar? No. Why? Because while there is a cause and effect dependency relationship, it doesn't follow that the two are the same thing or that one is inside the other. Your thoughts are not in your brain, they're in your mind, and your mind is not identical to your brain, nor is your mind physical. So, again, even though we've shown a cause or effect or dependence relation, it doesn't follow they're the same thing. And in the same way, just because you can do things to my brain that will affect the states of my mind, it doesn't follow that the mind and brain are the same thing, because to reiterate, causal dependence is not the same thing as identity, nor does it establish identity. And I'll end with this. Here's an argument I've used using what we just talked about. I was talking to a naturalist, and I never want to straw man someone, so I always want to make sure they hold to a certain view before I ask a certain line of questioning. I said, would you agree with me that if atheism is true, nothing non-physical should exist? He said, yeah, I agree with that. I said, okay, great. That's all I needed. And I said, okay, then that would also mean, by default, that if something non-physical did exist, then what? Very good. The atheism can't be true. And he said, yeah, I suppose I can agree with that. He said, well, like what? I said, well, I'm glad you asked. We can then say, if atheism is true, we can put it this way, then consciousness, if it exists, would have to be identical or reducible to something physical like the brain, right? So what that would mean, though, is that, whatever's true of the mind must be true of the brain and vice versa. But if we can show that there's at least one thing different, then it would mean that consciousness is not identical to the brain. And if consciousness is not identical to the brain, then it can't be physical. And if it can't be physical, well, it would mean that atheism cannot be true. So the question is consciousness physical? The short answer is no, but the more complicated long answer is no with more O's at the end, like no. Right? So, thank you. So let's look. I'll give you 3 examples. My thought or belief, it's a state of my mind. My thoughts or beliefs can be true or false. But when my neurons fire with that thought, my neurons firing aren't true or false. Makes no sense to say which of my neurons are true firing and which ones are false firing. Right? Doesn't make sense. My brain can weigh 3 pounds, but the thought that I'm talking to you right now doesn't weigh 3 pounds. While you may be having heavy thoughts throughout this lecture, we're not going to go buy neck braces when we're done here, right? Yeah, I got a little laugh here, thank you. My brain can be in a state that is 7 inches long, but the smell of a rose or the taste of a banana, which is in my mind, is not 7 inches long. And while there's many more examples, the point is simply this. If all the properties of my brain are physical, and all the properties of my brain are mind are non-physical, then it follows that consciousness, if it exists, cannot be identical or reducible to the physical. And if it can't be identical or reducible to the physical, well then, Mr. Atheist, if you're conscious, I guess that would mean that atheism cannot be true. Let me skip this. Have the book here, more about the conference. Alan Schleman, he works with Stand to Reason. If you've ever been to the reality conferences, he's one of the ones that run those. Elizabeth Urbanowicz is an expert in producing apologetic content for children. And when I say children, I mean literally like 5 to 12 years old, like producing Sunday school curriculum, homeschool curriculum, and does a great job with speaking to parents. These are our local guys talking about reliability of Scripture, reaching LGBTQ issues, and even just starting gospel conversations. If you want to go on my YouTube channel, you can check that out. You can look at debates I've done, debates on the soul. That's the one with Matt Dillahunty. I've done debates with Aaron Raw and other people on the soul, on God and Christianity, so on and so forth. It is 8:19. I don't mind taking questions, but I'll hand it over here in case, so that if we have to dismiss, we can, and then we can just do whatever you want to do from there.
Sure, yeah, we can sort of dismiss and stick around for questions for a few minutes. But first of all, we'll have a round of applause for We're going to head over to the Taco Bell on campus after this. Yeah. And hopefully, if Eric has time, he'll be able to join us. Please join us as well on Saturday for that debate watching, where you'll see that God's a miracle worker. All right.
Cool. Yeah. Maybe we should watch one of Eric's debates one of these times.
Yeah, we definitely should.
Oh, yeah. They're pretty good. I've seen them. Yeah, I don't mind. Yeah, go ahead.
So how does this stand up? Go back to the consciousness thing.
You go back to the consciousness thing.
How does this address the position that consciousness could be an emergent property, the same way that an ocean wave isn't a single...
Let's grant that. I don't think it is. Let's grant that. Still wouldn't be physical.
All right. But we also have things like, for example, an ocean wave isn't... You can't get a single particle of an ocean wave that's just a particle of water, but a little bit of salt. That is something that can be measured.
Yeah, so you're alluding to what's known as functionalism, which some people do. If you watch my debate with Aaron Raw on the soul, he alluded to that. And same rule applies with Leibniz's law. If you call the mind a function of the brain, well, same thing. My thoughts can be true or false, but a function isn't true or false. My toilet flushing is a function, but my toilet flushing doesn't flush true on some days and false on other days. It just flushes. It's a function. So if the mind is a functional emergent property of the brain, it still doesn't apply. They're still not the same thing as a function because my thoughts, true or false, brain firings aren't true or false.
By contrast, a wave is a physical entity.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. It's a whole other issue that I don't really have time to get into, but put it this way. Consciousness is what's called sui generis. It's a unique, novel property that is not found in the base parts. So to say that we can rearrange physical matter and get consciousness would be like saying we can rearrange the red bricks on a red house and get the color blue. It's not going to happen by rearranging physical matter. Yeah.
I recall a comparison. It was talking about the morning star and the evening star, and how like you can think of the morning star and you are not thinking of the evening star, and you can think of the evening star and you're not thinking of the morning star.
Yeah, I disagree. So what you're referring to are what are called the references, the reference, and long story short, you're no longer talking about identity in the strict sense. You're talking about names people use to label things. So let's say, my son knows my name, but my son's 7. He knows my name's Eric. But let's say, I don't know, 3 years ago, he didn't know my name was Eric. So if you went up to him and said, "Where's Eric?" he wouldn't know who you're talking about. But if you said, "Where's Daddy?" he would point to me. Now, does that mean that Eric and what he calls Daddy aren't the same person? Of course not. They're the same person. There's just different references. But no, at that point, we're no longer talking about the ontology. We're talking about how people view things and the words they use for them. So sure, we can use 2 different names for something that we don't know is the same, but ontologically speaking, it wouldn't negate the fact that they are the same, and there were just some properties something had that we weren't aware of because of a mistake of, let's say, night and day.
What do you call that field of like philosophical consideration?
Identity statements.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm curious what you would say to the sort of cultural idea that science is treated as an agent, where you have like the dog food commercial that the dog food is really healthy and science did that, or science tells us something like that. Is there anything that you would quickly say as a?
I'd say hogwash.
Yeah.
As I don't know who first said it, but maybe it was Lennox. Science doesn't say anything scientists do.
Yeah.
That's how I put it. Yeah, it'd be the same sentiment. Yes.
So I got a chance to debate apologia and Matt.
Oh, I'm sorry to hear that.
At the same time, yeah. It was
Oh gosh.
chaotic. But one point that apologia brought up was like that our belief should be proportionate to the evidence that we have. Like, you know, there may be some evidence that Bigfoots or aliens exist, but we shouldn't put our full faith in it. And likewise, we shouldn't put our full faith in the resurrection if the only evidence we have is testimony. So the claim being made is like that our belief should be proportionate to the evidence we have. Doesn't outright rule out the resurrection, but we should, in that sense, be agnostic as to the question of the resurrection. So I just want to know how you would respond to that.
Yeah. I would highly encourage you to not watch apologia videos, not because I'm afraid he's going to make you lose your faith. I really think it's a waste of time. He is one of the worst thinkers I know of. He critiqued one of my videos on the soul, and I'm like, wow, he was way off. And I commented, like, I'd be open to a debate. I'm not saying he read it and ran away. I just don't even know if he saw it. But, okay, one thing at a time. Beliefs should be proportionate to the evidence. Sure. Yes and amen. But the evidence is also coming from, and without getting into Bayesian analysis, which I'm not I don't know how to do Bayesian analysis very well. But essentially is this. You have to consider the background to something when you consider probability. First of all, to even ask if it was possible metaphysically for Jesus to rise from the dead, we have to first ask, is there a supernatural worldview? The answer is yes. Well, let's add that to this lens evidence and the probability of the evidence for Christianity. Then you ask, is there more to the physical? Is there more than the physical natural world to the universe? If the answer is yes, you add another point. Then you ask, does God exist? You add another point. And as you keep going, it becomes greater and greater amount of evidence to eventually say, yeah, if he can create something out of nothing, resurrection's not really a big deal. I think it was an atheist philosopher that said that. For a God who can create the universe out of nothing, the resurrection would be child's play. So it's not, and it's also not just eyewitness testimony. Without going, the last 3 or 4 chapters of my book is on the resurrection and Jesus. but it's far more than just eyewitness testimony. Because if someone claims to see Bigfoot downtown, they maybe really did, but it was also maybe a promotion for the upcoming movie. But I guarantee you, those people aren't going to get tortured and die for their belief that they saw Bigfoot. They might even recant it, even though they know that they saw it, but they just don't want to die for it because it's not that big of a deal of a belief to die for. Contrast that with the disciples that we know were martyred. Contrast that with James and John, who did not convert on the basis of eyewitness testimony. And talk to someone like J. Warner Wallace, who virtually all his cases are solved by eyewitness testimony or through eyewitness testimony because there is no physical or empirical evidence to account for, given that they're cold cases. So I think he has a horrible epistemology. I don't think he's considering the larger background set of evidence, including whether or not God exists, there's a supernatural worldview, et cetera, including the reliability of Scripture, including evidence we have for what was said in Scripture, the historical evidence, and so on and so forth. So for him to say it's only based on eyewitness testimony, that's ridiculous. Also, check this out. If he came home and his wife or his girlfriend, I had a discussion/debate with her. If she came home and said, "Oh my gosh, I saw John at the supermarket today," he's not going to say, "Well, you only have eyewitness testimony. I'm not going to believe that." Like, he turns up his skeptometer. He's also a skeptic. He turns up his skeptometer in areas he doesn't like, and areas he's willing to accept, he turns it down. Yeah. Yeah.
So if consciousness and the ability to think are non-physical, does that mean that animals are not conscious and can't think?
No, it would mean animals have souls.
But aren't animal souls material? Like
Says
according
who?
to the catechism?
I'm not Catholic, so.
Which catechism?
Yeah, but which?
Of the Catholic Church. Okay.
Yeah, I don't think they hold that to that though. Catholics would be
I think early
hylomorphous.
church fathers who were Catholic for sure believed in animal immaterial souls.
Okay.
I'm not as familiar with like current.
I never heard.
Aquinas pretty directly saying no, there is no animal soul.
Well, Aquinas got some things right.
I remember him saying exactly the opposite of that there definitely are animal souls. And even
So if you look in the Bible, go to Blue Letter Bible, and look in Genesis chapter 1 and 2, and it says when God made the land animals, it says He made the land nephesh creatures, and nephesh is a Hebrew word for soul. And I mean, there's lots of other arguments I can go into that I won't have time to, but here, I'll put it this way: if anything is conscious, it necessarily needs a soul. Are animals conscious?
They certainly seem to be.
Then they certainly have a soul.
Okay, so you're saying a soul for animals has to be immaterial.
All souls are immaterial. I don't know of any soul that's not immaterial.
Doesn't Job say, like, who knows whether the spirit of animal goes down into the earth or up into the heaven?
That's a good point.
Yeah. Very
The
good.
only physical soul is the one you drive. Huh?
That's right. Yes. That's a good point. Touche. I
Don't
stand
forget about that
corrected.
one.
I stand corrected.
There you go.
Anything else?
She has a question, right?
Oh, yes, I'm sorry. And then after this, if you have a question, you have to buy me a taco. Go ahead.
This is less of a philosophy and more of like, should the goal of such a discussion be to turn the conversation into talking more about the gospel, or is it better to just stay focused on the philosophy?
Great question. So you weren't here for my lazy approach talk, I assume, no, right? That's all right. It might be recorded and archived somewhere, I'm not sure.
Probably our YouTube channel still has it, I think.
So one thing I say there is so the first thing to understand with evangelism is there is a difference between gardening and harvesting. And I cannot harvest something that hasn't been gardened, right? So say the skeptic I was talking to about, resurrection and the water and, my senses can be deceiving me. He's definitely not ready to entertain the possibility the gospel might be true. So before I can harvest, I have to garden. And think of the work of a gardener. Plant seed, till the soil, pull weeds, take bugs off, make sure there's water, make sure there's sunlight. And I think we need a lot more gardeners these days and not so many harvesters. When you read in John chapter 4, here's what Jesus says. He's talking to harvesters, and he says, you have reaped where you have not sown. I've sent you to reap where you have not sown. Then he says something interesting. Others have done the hard work, and you have reaped the benefits of their labor. Who are the others? Well, that's us, the gardeners. So if I'm talking to someone who doesn't even believe there is a supernatural worldview, giving him the gospel would almost be pointless the only virtue would be that I guess he gets to hear it, but it's going to go in one ear out the other because it's not within his plausibility structure that there is even a supernatural worldview. And in his mind, only the physical world exists, so a God who is by definition non-physical doesn't even make sense to him. So the gospel there wouldn't do much. And I'll give you some biblical basis here. You look at Acts 17, Paul, he's on Mars Hill in Athens. He doesn't share the gospel. At best, you could say it was the gospel when he says in like 6 words, after he gives an entire presentation and a natural theological argument for God's existence via their own poets and philosophers. He doesn't quote scripture, he quotes their poets and philosophers. He makes an argument based on that, which is a brilliant argument. And then in one verse with about 6 words, he says, and he proved it by raising Jesus from the dead. And you could almost hear him saying it fast because he spends like 20 verses on the argument for God's existence and then says, and he proved it by raising Jesus from the dead. And then it says, and everybody went in an uproar. And I imagine he said it fast because as soon as he brought up resurrection, they would have been like, boo, get off stage, and like probably try to kill him. That's a longer story. But all that to say, yeah, there was no gospel presentation there other than repent because God wants you to, and he proved this by raising Jesus from the dead. So it's going to depend where they're at. I went to, I'll say this last thing in closing. I went to Jerusalem, Israel a couple years ago. And we went to First Baptist Church Bethlehem to talk with the pastor there. A pastor who has legitimately encountered and their members encounter persecution. We get there, we sit down, and he's like kind of pacing nervously, like he doesn't know how to start. And he's like, hey, I just want to get this off my chest. He said, I'm glad you Americans are here, and I just want to say this. If you want to go out and share the gospel today, that's fine. Just know that your fast food gospel doesn't work here. I was like, oh, I love this guy. Like already, I loved it. And he says, if you're going to go out and share your stories or, whatever, or, talk about this, it's not going to work. Because over here, he says, we have Jews to this side, Palestinians over here, and Muslims over here. If someone's going to convert to Christianity, it's not going to be because you gave them a nice, heartfelt story. It's going to be because they were convinced, and more than that, because they're willing to not just change where they go to church on Sundays, but be willing to give up their jobs, their family, their livelihood, and possibly their lives. He said, our altar calls here last 2 weeks, and I'm paraphrasing, and here's what he means by that. Let's say Drayden here is a Muslim considering Christianity. My altar call for him is not raise your hand and come to the front. My altar call is meet me after church and says, okay, here's the hotel, here's a room number. You have 2 weeks to stay in this hotel, paid for by the church anonymously, and within those 2 weeks, make your decision. So they pay for 2 weeks hotel for them to be away from their family so they can make the decision to follow Christ or not, because they know that they cannot make that in front of their family, and they know that if they make the decision, once they leave that hotel, their lives are at stake. So, if I were to go over there and start witnessing, I probably wouldn't start off with the gospel. And again, I would say that there's biblical precedent for that. So it's going to depend. And here, this is gardening work. And I clearly lay that out in the book. We need to learn how to garden before we start harvesting. Yeah. And there's a place for both, of course. Thank you.